She said it was time for me to step aside. That old age wasn't the time for independent decisions. My son said nothing, but handed me the pen. I signed, gave it all away. The house, the land, the keys. They thought I had left for good, that I had become one of those silent mothers buried in solitude. But I came back, not for revenge, but to sign one last document, the one where my name was first again, and the only one that mattered. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Evelyn Hill. I was 67 years old when I first began to realize the meaning of silence. Not the kind that comes at night or in church, but the kind that wraps around you after years of being useful, years of being needed, and then, suddenly, not. I had lived in my house in rural Virginia for over 4 decades. I wasn't just familiar with every creaking floorboard and stubborn drawer. I had chosen the tiles myself, painted every window frame, planted every bush in the yard. It wasn't just a house. It was a reflection of everything I had poured into life. My care, my time, my marriage. I was a retired nurse, 31 years in the same hospital, most of them spent in the palliative care unit. I wasn't squeamish, and I wasn't naive. I had seen people at their worst, their most scared, and sometimes their most grateful. I knew what dying looked like, what regret sounded like. That kind of job either softens you or hardens you. I think it did both to me, in layers. I didn't raise my voice often, but when I did, people listened. Or they used to. After my husband died, lung cancer, quick and cruel, I thought the house would feel too big. But it didn't. I filled the silence with small rituals. Morning coffee on the porch with the birds, watering my herbs in the early light, baking too much and freezing half of it. The kind of life that only looks empty to people who never learned how to live alone. I didn't resent my solitude. I had grown into it. My son, Andrew, visited sometimes. Not often. He lived in the city, had a demanding job in tech, a wife named Melissa, and a daughter, my granddaughter, Sophie. When they came, the house echoed with life. Sophie's footsteps, her laughter, the smell of store-bought cupcakes, the low thrum of Andrew's phone always buzzing. Melissa was polite usually, tense around me, though I never fully understood why. I thought maybe it was just our differences. Her world was sleek, fast, focused on branding and appearance. Mine was slower, quieter, filled with things that didn't need charging or constant praise. They came to stay during a renovation of their condo. Just for a few weeks, they said. It was easier for Sophie, less disruption during school. I made up the guest room, dusted the old toy chest, stocked the fridge with Melissa's favorite almond milk. I welcomed them like I always had, fully, with both arms open and expectations low. But something shifted quickly. Melissa started organizing the pantry in ways that confused me. Labels facing out, only 3 brands of anything. She replaced my spice rack. Andrew set up a workstation in the dining room and asked me not to interrupt during his Zoom calls. Sophie was mostly glued to her tablet, and when I suggested reading together or going for a walk, Melissa would gently redirect her towards something more productive. It was subtle, but steady. My routines shrank. My corners became their common space. They never said it aloud, but I could feel it in the way they paused before asking if it was okay to move a chair, paint a wall, rearrange the bookshelves. I adjusted, the way older people do when they want peace more than they want control. I stopped using the kitchen during the day. I ate breakfast at odd hours. I told myself it was temporary, that they were guests, that soon enough the house would go back to being mine. But I began to notice Melissa referring to it as the house, never your house. Andrew talked about upgrades, smart thermostats, an open concept kitchen, like he was already making blueprints. I overheard them whispering once in the hallway. Melissa's voice sharp, Andrew's lower. I caught just one sentence. She won't need all this much longer anyway. I didn't say anything. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded. I wasn't angry, not then. More curious, the way a nurse might be when watching symptoms take shape. After dinner that night, Andrew handed me a folder, a few forms, a signature request. Just to simplify things, Mom. Melissa smiled without showing her teeth. I nodded slowly. I didn't open it that evening. I washed the dishes instead, the way I always had, with hot water, a sponge, and too much care. I watched the two of them laugh in the living room while Sophie danced with her headphones on, spinning like the house was hers. And for the first time, I wondered what it meant to be home if no one saw you in it. The folder sat on the edge of the dining room table for 2 days. It blended in with the rest of the clutter. School papers, Melissa's unopened mail, a candle that had burned halfway down. No one mentioned it again. But it was always there, a quiet suggestion that waited to be obeyed. I moved it once to dust underneath, and for a moment I considered opening it. But something in me resisted. Not because I feared what it said. I trusted Andrew, and I didn't believe he would ever deceive me. But because I sensed that opening it would confirm something I wasn't ready to name. Still, on the third morning, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the table before anyone else had come downstairs. I opened the folder slowly, expecting a simple document. I didn't understand all of it. The language was legal, dense, thick with words like transfer, beneficiary, trustee. But one phrase kept appearing: power of attorney, durable, revocable. I paused at the word revocable, unsure of its implications. There was a line at the bottom. My name was already typed. All that was missing was my signature. I stared at the space where they expected me to sign. It looked small, insignificant, and yet it felt as if once ink touched that paper, something irreversible would begin. I thought about how often, during my years as a nurse, I had witnessed families sign away decisions, some with relief, some with regret. I had always believed I would never let someone else speak on my behalf. And now, here I was, holding the pen. The room smelled faintly of lemons from the cleaner Melissa used. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that follows when you're the last to speak and everyone's waiting. I signed it. I signed it without reading everything, without calling a lawyer, without asking questions. I told myself I was doing it to help, to make things easier for Andrew, to show trust. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want conflict. I didn't want to be the problem. And more than anything, I didn't want to believe that my own son would ever use it against me. Afterward, I put the folder back in its place. Andrew nodded when he noticed it was signed. Melissa made coffee. Sophie asked for waffles. The house moved forward like nothing had changed, but something had. Over the following weeks, I began to notice small differences. Bills no longer arrived in the mailbox. My name was missing from the latest property tax notice. Andrew offered to take care of, renewing the homeowner's insurance. I no longer had access to the family bank account I had managed for decades. When I asked, he said it was easier for him to centralize everything. Less confusion, less paperwork. I let it happen. Piece by piece, the life I had built, the life I had maintained, was shifted into other hands. My name faded from paperwork, from credit cards, from even the prescription bottles I used to pick up on my own. Everything was consolidated, and I too began to feel like I had been folded into the background. Melissa started referring to the house as our place. She talked about renovations with the confidence of someone who already owned the space. Andrew began working longer hours in the office he had claimed. My sewing machine was moved into the laundry room. My books were boxed and put in the garage for space. No one asked me about it. They simply told me afterward with a smile that it was more convenient. One night, I walked past the living room and heard them talking, not arguing, planning, discussing a new kitchen layout, a potential buyer eventually, maybe a move closer to the city in a year or two. The way they spoke made it clear they weren't dreaming aloud. They were executing a strategy, and I was not a part of it. I began to feel like a guest in the house I had once called home. I tiptoed around their schedules, avoided shared spaces during busy times, stayed in my room longer. I ate meals at odd hours to avoid the tension at the table. My routines dissolved. Even Sophie, sweet as she was, had started parroting phrases like, "Mom says you shouldn't stress about things," as if concern for my own life was a nuisance. The breaking point came quietly. I received a call from the bank about a flagged transaction. When I identified myself, the woman paused and asked me to confirm my authority on the account. I gave my name. She said I was no longer listed. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, unable to find words. Later that evening, I asked Andrew about it. He looked tired, said he meant to mention it, that since everything was under the trust now, I didn't need to worry, that it was for my protection, that I had signed it, remember? I remembered. That night, I sat in bed with the lights off. The house around me buzzed with the faint sounds of electronics, the hum of the refrigerator, the tapping of keys on Melissa's laptop down the hall. I had the strange sensation of floating, not through space, but through time. Like I had skipped ahead to a version of my life I didn't recognize. I thought about the young nurse I used to be, standing beside hospital beds, helping families make choices they never imagined they'd face. I had always believed knowledge was protection, but in that moment I understood how quickly trust could become a weapon. I looked around my room, the only space I still had any control over, and I realized I had signed away my power, not just legally, but emotionally, voluntarily, and now I was watching my own life move on without me, like I was already gone. When I left, it wasn't dramatic. No suitcases flung down the stairs, no slammed doors, just quiet. Andrew offered to help pack, but I declined. Melissa hugged me with the kind of gentleness reserved for old acquaintances or coworkers at retirement parties. Sophie waved without lifting her eyes from her tablet. I smiled, told them I'd be fine, and meant it, or wanted to. My departure was framed as temporary, a break, something I needed for my health. They said it with that tone people use when they've already moved on in their minds. I moved into a small room in Arizona, in a single-story house owned by a woman named Karen, a widow I'd met once through a hospital event a decade earlier. She rented out her spare room to women like me, alone, quiet, too proud to say they had nowhere else to go. It was modest, a twin bed, a dresser with a stuck drawer, a lamp that buzzed faintly when turned on. The walls were bare. The air smelled like dust and faint lavender. I brought only what I could carry: a box of photographs, a few clothes, a jewelry box, and my husband's watch, which hadn't worked in years. The rest I left behind. It felt lighter that way, less final. I didn't cry the first week. I woke up early, made coffee, took walks through the dry neighborhood where the grass was more gravel than green. The silence was heavy but familiar. It reminded me of hospital corridors at night, still, alert, waiting for something to happen. I filled my days with small habits. I read old paperbacks. I clipped newspaper coupons I never used. I organized my socks. It was a kind of ritual, like drawing a map to a place I couldn't name yet. Karen wasn't unkind. She was practical. We didn't talk much, but but she invited me to eat when she cooked, and we watched television sometimes without commenting on the plot. I didn't tell her the full story. I just said my son and his family needed space. She nodded like she'd heard it before. Maybe she had. In that house, I began to notice things I had ignored for years. My hands trembled slightly when I held a spoon too long. My hips ached when I sat for more than an hour. I had spent decades caring for others, bending over hospital beds, lifting weight that wasn't mine, ignoring every warning sign in my own body. Now, in that stillness, it all returned to me. Each evening, I waited for a call that didn't come. I checked my email obsessively, though I had no reason to expect anything. I wrote letters to Sophie, simple ones, filled with drawings and silly jokes. I mailed them with stickers on the envelopes. The first month, I received 2 replies, childlike handwriting, then nothing. The space between me and my former life stretched like elastic. At first, I believed it would snap back, that someone would notice the absence. That absence meant something, but it didn't. It just expanded. I watched the seasons change through the windows. In Virginia, spring would have been blooming. Here, it was sun and dust, hard soil and dry wind. I missed the smell of my own garden, the familiar creak of the porch swing, the warmth of a home where my photos once hung. I missed having a door that opened because someone expected me. One morning, I woke early before dawn and sat on the small patio behind Karen's house. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painted with soft oranges and grays. Birds stirred in the brittle trees. I held my mug with both hands and stared into the distance, where the mountains barely touched the edge of the world. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say aloud. I was no longer part of their lives, not just forgotten, but erased. Like a signature that had been legally removed, like a photo frame turned face down. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger takes energy, and I was still too hollow for that. What I felt was weightless, not free, not unburdened, just suspended. Like a balloon someone had let go of, drifting upward until the string was no longer visible. Sometimes I imagined them, back in the house, moving furniture, repainting walls, calling it theirs, without hesitation. I wondered if they had noticed how quiet it was without me. I wondered if they used my teacups. I wondered if my name ever came up in conversation, or if it had already faded from daily speech, like a dream you forget before breakfast. I walked a lot during those months. It gave me a sense of direction, even if I always returned to the same place. I waved at strangers. I smiled at dogs. I memorized the patterns of the cracks in the sidewalk. Every step felt like proof that I was still here, that I hadn't disappeared entirely. But inside, something had shifted. I had gone from homeowner to visitor, from matriarch to nobody. And though the world hadn't noticed, I had. That quiet change settled into my bones like dust on an untouched shelf. I didn't yet know what I would do about it, but I knew one thing with a clarity that startled me. I would not remain forgotten forever. It started with a bill I couldn't pay. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of mail Karen had handed me earlier that morning. Most of it was junk, ads, donation requests, a coupon book for a grocery store I never visited. Then I saw the envelope from my insurance provider. I had been expecting it. My health coverage renewal was due, and I'd planned to pay it from the small account I still believed was mine. I opened the letter, reviewed the numbers, then pulled out my checkbook. When I logged into my online bank account to confirm the balance, the screen flashed red. Account not found. I refreshed the page, checked my Wi-Fi, logged out and back in again. Still nothing. A hollow coldness settled over me as I clicked through menus and options, each one leading to a dead end. I picked up the phone and called the bank. After navigating the endless automated prompts, I finally reached a human voice. The woman on the line was polite but firm. She asked for my name, birth date, and address. I gave her all the details. Then I heard the hesitation, a pause followed by typing. She informed me that my access had been revoked. The account, she said, was now managed under a separate name. She couldn't disclose more than that. I thanked her mechanically and hung up. The phone slipped from my hand and landed on the table with a dull thud. I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. The checkbook lay open in front of me, the pen still resting on the blank line where I had started to write my name. Later that day, I went to the bank in person. I brought my ID, utility bills, even old printed statements with my name on them. The teller looked uncomfortable as she read through them, typing something into her terminal. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a manager. They brought me into a small glass-walled office, offered me water, and spoke in low voices. They explained that the account had been consolidated under a trust, that I no longer had authority over it, that I had signed the transfer months ago. They were right. I had signed it. I smiled, thanked them, and walked out of the building into the blistering Arizona sun. The pavement shimmered. Cars moved slowly in the heat. I crossed the parking lot with slow, deliberate steps, my shadow trailing behind me like a stranger. Back at Karen's house, I sat on the porch and stared out at the brittle landscape. Everything looked washed out. Dry earth, sun-bleached rocks, sparse bushes fighting to survive. I thought of my house in Virginia, of the soft moss under the garden tap, of the kitchen window that always fogged up when I boiled water, of the bed I used to make with hospital corners out of habit. That night, I pulled out the box I had brought with me when I left. Inside were old papers, photographs, and a single small key. I remembered the lock it matched, an old safe bolted to the back wall of my linen closet. I had nearly forgotten it. Inside were copies of documents my husband had insisted we keep: the original deed to the house, our marriage certificate, the insurance policies, and, most importantly, his will. He had left the house to me with no stipulations. It had been clear, specific, and uncontested. I had filed it properly, stored the duplicates, paid taxes, and renewed insurance every year. But now, someone else had taken that certainty and turned it into a fog of legality. I called the lawyer who had helped us with our estate planning. He was retired, but he remembered me. He sounded surprised to hear from me, but not reluctant. I told him I needed copies. He said he'd find them. Within days, a thick envelope arrived with everything I asked for. I spread the documents across the kitchen table and read every line this time. Slowly, carefully. I marked dates, underlined phrases, made notes in the margins. I built a file. From there, I called another attorney, a younger man, the son of a nurse I had once trained. He specialized in elder law. I didn't tell him the whole story. I told him just enough to explain what I needed: clarity, options, protection. He listened. He explained how trusts worked, how power of attorney functioned, and how abuse of those powers could be challenged. It wasn't easy, he warned, but it wasn't impossible. For weeks, I gathered every document I could find: tax records, bank statements, insurance correspondence, letters, copies of emails. I reached out to the county clerk to request public records. I requested a full copy of the house deed and cross-checked the changes. What I found confirmed my suspicion. My son had quietly shifted ownership under the pretense of managing things for my benefit. I wasn't sure what hurt more, that he had done it or that I had given him the pen to do it with. I stopped sending letters to Sophie. I no longer looked at the family photos I had saved in my phone. I turned inward, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. I was no longer a mother trying to be included. I was a woman building a case. And underneath the layers of sadness and confusion, something new began to take shape, a thin but steady line of resolve. I didn't tell Karen what I was doing. I kept my papers in a lockbox and worked on them in the afternoons, after my walks. My days became methodical, almost clinical. It reminded me of charting patient records, cross-referencing symptoms with timelines, building a story that made sense to a skeptical attending physician. This time, the attending was the law, and the patient was me. Every page I added to the file felt like another stone in the foundation of something solid, something that might hold. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew that I was done being erased. They had taken my name off the account, but they hadn't taken my name out of the house. Not yet. Delaware wasn't where I pictured the next chapter of my life, but it offered me something I couldn't find anywhere else: quiet anonymity. I moved into a small rental house near the edge of a town most people drove through without noticing. The trees were older than the houses, and the sidewalks were cracked in familiar ways. It felt unremarkable, which for once was a relief. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted space to think. My niece Rachel helped me settle in. She worked full-time at the local library and lived in a one-bedroom apartment down the road. We weren't particularly close before, but she welcomed me without questions. She offered help, rides, and dinners when she could. I accepted her kindness with gratitude, and we didn't speak much about my past. That silence was a kindness of its own. I filled my days with small routines: morning walks before the sun got too hot, grocery runs with a list that rarely changed. I volunteered twice a week at a nearby care center, helping organize linens and reading to residents whose families stopped visiting years ago. I never told them I used to be a nurse. I just folded sheets, wheeled carts, and listened. I understood their silences, their lingering stares at the hallway clocks. Time had a different weight in places like that. In the evenings, I worked. Not a job, but a purpose. I turned the spare bedroom into a study and lined the wall with folders, legal pads, printouts, and documents that I had spent weeks collecting. I organized everything into sections: financial records, house deeds, notarized documents, communication logs. I highlighted, cross-referenced, and made timelines. It was meticulous work, the kind that demanded patience and a steady hand. I had both. Sometimes I would sit on the floor with papers spread around me like puzzle pieces. I stared at them, looking for the pattern. The moment everything shifted, it wasn't hard to find. The paper trail was subtle but clear. The transfer of power, the change in access, the shift in language, from yours to ours, then ours to his. I traced every line back to the signature, my own. But I wasn't interested in regret anymore. I was interested in accountability. I reached out to a second attorney, someone recommended by the elder care director at the center. Her name was Camille, and she had the kind of voice that didn't rise or fall, just cut through doubt like a scalpel. I brought my binder, laid it on her desk, and let her read. She didn't ask many questions at first, just nodded as she turned each page, occasionally making notes. When she finally looked up, she said it plainly: "You have a case." That was the first time I let myself believe it. Camille explained what could be done and what couldn't: the challenge of reversing certain documents, the way courts interpret intent, the weight of timing. But she also told me that abuse of power, even by family, had consequences, that what was done to me wasn't just a misunderstanding. It had a name: financial exploitation. The words echoed in my head for days. I had spent my life protecting others, from pain, from confusion, from themselves. I had never imagined I'd need protection from the people I loved most. And yet, here I was, stitching together the truth like a garment that had been torn without warning. I found comfort in the details: the way dates lined up, the way handwriting changed tone, The way Melissa's emails always use the phrase "as discussed" to imply conversations that never happened. I documented everything, every unanswered call, every forwarded bill, every photograph of the house I found online showing new renovations they never mentioned. Some nights I couldn't sleep. The walls of the rental house were thin, and the shadows moved strangely in the corners. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the way sunlight used to pour through my kitchen window at home. I could still feel the weight of the knife I used to slice fruit every morning. I could still hear the squeak of the back door as it closed behind me when I stepped into the garden. All of it belonged to a life that had been paused without my consent. I didn't speak to Andrew. I didn't call Melissa. I didn't write to Sophie. That part of me was done waiting. What I wanted now wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. During one of our meetings, Camille asked if I wanted to go public with my case, make an example, pursue restitution. I shook my head. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about returning something to its rightful place. My name, my dignity, my home. I continued volunteering. The residents began to greet me with soft smiles and familiar nods. I read to them with the same cadence I once used for Sophie when she was little. I spoke softly, clearly, giving shape to words that might otherwise vanish. In some ways, those afternoons reminded me that connection wasn't always about blood. It was about presence. As summer faded into fall, I noticed the shift in air. The wind carried a bite again. The trees began to whisper, dropping leaves like tired hands letting go. I kept my coat near the door and my files ready. One afternoon, as I was packing up a stack of notes, a letter slid through the mail slot. It was from a real estate agency. I opened it slowly. Inside was a full-color flyer of my old house, listed for sale. New kitchen, renovated bathrooms. Perfect for families. Beneath it, the listing agent's name. I read it twice. Then I looked again at the photos. There was no trace of me, not one, no photo, no memory, no fingerprint. But they had made a mistake. The sale was pending, not final, and the trust paperwork, cleverly revised but sloppily recorded, was still flawed. I placed the flyer into a new folder, labeled it Evidence Phase 2, and exhaled. The shadows on the wall grew longer as the sun dipped low. I stood up slowly, flicked on the desk lamp, and returned to my notes. They had removed me from the picture, but they hadn't erased the truth. Not yet, and I was ready to bring it into the light. It was a Wednesday morning when the email arrived. I had been sipping coffee, sitting by the window as I often did, watching the wind twist leaves along the sidewalk. The subject line was simple, almost cheerful. New listing in your area. I clicked on it without thinking. Real estate emails had become routine since I'd once searched for rentals in the region. What I didn't expect was to see my old address staring back at me, bolded, underlined, and paired with a glossy photo that made my chest tighten. There it was, my house. Not just any house, my home, the one my husband and I built room by room over the course of our marriage, the one I raised my son in, the one I had scrubbed, repaired, painted, and filled with decades of meals, holidays, grief, and laughter. Now it was labeled modernized colonial with updated features and tagged with a price that made my stomach flip. I clicked through the gallery. The living room walls had been painted a sterile shade of gray. The fireplace, once lined with bricks my husband had laid himself, was now hidden behind smooth white tile. The kitchen had been gutted. New countertops, new cabinets, sleek stainless steel appliances. My floral curtains were gone. So was the crooked cabinet door that never quite closed. The garden was paved over, replaced by a deck that looked like it had never felt mud or rain. My rose bushes were gone. My lilac tree, The one that had bloomed every spring since the year my son was born had been cut down. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat very still, staring at the photos, studying them like evidence, because that's what they were, proof, not of progress, not of change, but of erasure. They had tried to erase me from my own life, one renovation at a time. Later that day, I printed every photo, every page of the listing. I circled names, dates, license numbers. The agency was reputable. The realtor was local. I recognized her name. She had sold homes for a few of my former neighbors. I called her office and requested information on the seller. She told me politely that such information wasn't available to the public, but she mentioned something that made me pause. "You must be calling about the trust sale." My breath caught. I thanked her and hung up. I called Camille. She listened carefully as I read the language from the listing and forwarded her the full digital file. She told me what I already suspected. They couldn't legally sell the property without my explicit approval, not if the trust was still tied to my name, not if the transfer had been incomplete, or worse, misrepresented. Camille filed a stop notice the next morning. A letter was sent to the agency, to the buyers, to the title office. Everything froze. I imagined Andrew's face when he got the call. I imagined Melissa pacing in the kitchen of the house they had polished and prepped like it was theirs to give away. I imagined the confusion, then the frustration, then the slow, inevitable realization. I wasn't gone. I had never truly left. For days, the listing stayed up, but the word pending vanished. Then came the updates. The open house was canceled. The price was removed. The listing disappeared altogether the following week. But by then, the damage had been done, not to me, but to their plan. I received a curt email from Andrew. It didn't ask how I was. It didn't explain. It simply requested clarification on the legal restrictions. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Camille, who responded on my behalf with a level of precision that didn't leave space for negotiation. My name was still on the deed. The trust had been misused. Any further attempts to sell the property would be considered fraudulent and contested in court. That was the last I heard from him. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with my breath, my resolve, my right to reclaim what had been taken without consent. I revisited every document we had on file. Camille walked me through the next steps: how to formalize the reversal, how to resecure the title, how to ensure no one could attempt this again. The process took time. Legal systems move slowly, but they move. And each letter we received, each confirmation, each reinstatement of my authority was another brick in a wall I was rebuilding, this time around myself. In between calls and filings, I walked more. The days grew shorter, the light sharper. I began to feel something unfamiliar settle inside me, not triumph, but balance. A sense that the scales, once tilted so heavily away from me, were beginning to level out. I didn't tell Rachel about the sale, not yet. I wanted to hold it close a little longer, like a secret I'd finally taken back from the people who thought I'd given it away for good. One evening, I took the stack of printed listing photos and laid them across my kitchen table. I studied each one, not with grief, but with clarity. I saw what had been done. I saw what had been lost. But I also saw what remained: my name, my history, my fingerprints in every beam, every tile, every nail they hadn't noticed. They tried to sell the house. They couldn't sell the home because I was still in it, not in the walls or the rooms or the furniture, in the fight, in the proof, in the name on the line they couldn't erase. I arrived early in the morning, just after sunrise. The sky above Virginia was pale and thin, the way it always looked before the heat of spring settled in. My rental car coasted down the familiar road in near silence, tires humming over the uneven pavement. I hadn't been back in over a year, but nothing about the curve of the street, The sway of the trees or the angle of the morning light felt unfamiliar. Time hadn't erased the map from my memory. It had only deepened it. As I turned onto my old street, a strange calm settled over me. My heartbeat didn't quicken. My palms didn't sweat. What I felt wasn't excitement or dread. It was certainty. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The house stood where it always had, but it looked different now. Not because of the renovations or the changes in the landscaping, but because of what I now knew. It no longer loomed with loss. It stood as a place reclaimed. The lawn was trimmed too neatly. The flower beds were barren, filled with decorative gravel and uniform shrubs that lacked any wildness. The front porch had been power washed and repainted, but the boards still sagged slightly near the second step, just like they always had. No one had fixed that. I parked across the street and sat for a few minutes, watching the windows. The blinds were half drawn. The mailbox was open, a stack of envelopes peeking out. There was no movement inside. The house looked staged, clean, artificial, suspended. I walked up the path with steady steps. My shoes clicked softly against the concrete. In my hand, I carried a folder, thick with legal documents, copies of the trust, the deed, the court ruling, and Camille's final letter of closure. Everything was signed, stamped, certified. The sale was dead. The title was restored. My name was once again the only one that mattered. I didn't knock. The key still worked. I turned it slowly and stepped inside. The air smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and faint cologne. The walls had been repainted a soft, soulless white. Family photos were gone, replaced by generic framed prints. Beaches, boats, quotes about home in cursive font. It was a showroom, not a memory. I walked through the rooms one by one. The hardwood floor was polished, but the scratches near the hallway closet were still there. Sophie had left them riding her tricycle indoors during a rainstorm. Melissa had been furious. I had laughed, then helped her buff them out with furniture oil. We never fully erased them. The kitchen had been overhauled. Granite countertops, a fancy island with bar stools, new fixtures. But the tile backsplash was crooked. I ran my fingers across it, feeling where one tile jutted slightly, breaking the pattern. I had chosen the original tile with my husband. We installed it together, arguing over placement until we settled on an off-center pattern we both liked. Now, someone had tried to perfect it and failed. I found the listing folder on the table, right where I expected it. Contracts, printouts, inspection reports, all now irrelevant. I flipped through the pages, checking for anything they might have missed. My eyes settled on a final draft of the seller's disclosure. Andrew's signature was there, scrawled quickly at the bottom, as if he had been eager to be done with it. I placed my documents beside it. Then I sat, in the chair I had chosen 25 years ago at a flea market. They'd kept it, probably because it matched the new aesthetic. I ran my hand along the edge of the table. It still had the chip from when Andrew, as a child, had knocked over a ceramic bowl. I had glued it back together and never replaced it. Some things I'd always believed were worth keeping broken. Footsteps echoed upstairs, light, hesitant. A door creaked. Then silence again. I waited. Eventually, Melissa appeared at the top of the stairs. She wore a crisp blouse, her hair perfectly styled, a phone in her hand. Her eyes met mine, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. She looked older, thinner, more brittle around the edges. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I rose, walked past her without slowing, and headed to what had once been my bedroom. The furniture was different, the walls painted blue, but the window still faced the same oak tree, and the corner of the ceiling still bore the faint water stain from a storm years ago. I stood there, letting the familiarity sink into my bones. I returned to the living room, gathered my folder, and placed it on top of theirs. I left the house through the back door, stepping onto the deck that now covered where my garden used to be. The wood felt hollow under my feet. I stood at the edge and looked out at the yard, empty, sterile, stripped of every vine, every flower, every sign that someone once loved the land. They had removed the life from this place, but they couldn't remove its memory. By the following week, the house was empty again. They moved out without confrontation, without apologies, without ceremony. A moving truck arrived early one morning. Furniture was carried out. Boxes were stacked. A vase shattered on the porch, and no one picked up the pieces. I watched from my car, parked further down the street. When they were gone, I walked back to the house and opened the door. No one stopped me. No one had the right to. This time, I crossed the threshold not as a visitor or a burden, but as the owner, not just in name, but in presence. I set my keys on the counter. I boiled water for tea. I stood in my own kitchen and listened to the house breathe. And it did, quietly, like it had been waiting for me to come home. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't the silence of absence or exile. It wasn't a punishment or a symptom. It was stillness, the kind that followed resolution, the kind I had waited for without knowing. For days, I moved through the room slowly, relearning the dimensions of my own space. The floor still creaked near the front door. The third stair still let out a low groan when stepped on. The light in the hallway flickered slightly at dusk. These imperfections welcomed me back like old friends. I had returned not to the version they tried to sell, but to the truth they couldn't erase. I began to unpack what little I had kept. A ceramic mug from my early nursing days, a framed photo of my husband taken on our first trip to Maine, a threadbare quilt with uneven stitching. I placed them back in the corners where they had once belonged. There was no rush. Each object had its own memory, and I took time letting each one settle. I did not try to restore the house to what it had been. Too much had changed. But I did reclaim it. Slowly, patiently. I planted new herbs in small pots near the kitchen window. I pulled weeds from the cracks in the garden beds and let the earth speak again. I ordered curtains that were too bright and too floral and hung them with stubborn pride. I brought the books back from storage and lined the shelves alphabetically, as I used to do when I needed order. I didn't hear from Andrew or Melissa again. Their absence was not a wound, but a choice I now understood. I no longer replayed conversations in my mind or imagined alternate endings. The past didn't need rewriting, it needed closure, and that I had given myself. Every morning I brewed tea and drank it on the back porch. The view was different. The garden was smaller and the trees trimmed back too far. But the morning light still filtered through the branches in soft golden strands. The birds still came. The wind still knew its way through the grass. I sat with it all, with no need to name it or control it. It just was, and so was I. There were moments when the house echoed too loudly, when the evening shadows pressed in a little too close, when the silence reminded me of all I had lost. But they passed, and I let them. I no longer feared loneliness the way I once had. It wasn't an enemy. It was a room I could enter without trembling. I joined a local gardening group that met every Thursday at the community center. I said little, but listened often. I volunteered at the food bank twice a month, sorting cans, folding boxes, placing fresh bread into the hands of strangers who sometimes reminded me of myself. I smiled more, not because I was happy in a way people expect, but because I was no longer carrying weight that didn't belong to me. One afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found a letter without a return address. Inside was a single card. No note, just a photograph. Sophie smiling in front of a school project, her name written in large letters across the bottom. I didn't know if it was sent by Andrew or Melissa, or even by Sophie herself. I didn't try to trace it. I placed it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a sunflower and left it there, neither worshiping nor ignoring it. Some connections I had learned weren't meant to be forced. Some were simply offered and accepted, like a bowl of soup left on a doorstep. Spring melted into summer. I started painting again, nothing serious, just watercolors of the sky, the garden, the chipped teacup I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I hung a few of them in the hallway. They made the house feel alive again. Not perfect, but living. One morning, while walking through the farmer's market, I passed by a woman I recognized from the care center where I used to volunteer. She looked tired, hunched from years of lifting people who didn't know her name. I followed her quietly to the lot, waited until she finished loading groceries into a rusted sedan, and asked if she needed help. She didn't recognize me, but she smiled and said yes. A week later, I began the paperwork to gift the house. Not to her directly, not yet, but to a fund I created with Camille's help. One designed to shelter women who had nowhere to go, no one to ask, and nothing left to sign. I didn't want applause. I didn't need credit. I wanted only to give someone the thing I had almost lost forever, safety without shame. I stayed in the house until the end of the year. Then I packed a single suitcase, locked the door, and left the keys with Camille. She would know when and how to pass them on. I didn't cry when I left. I didn't turn around for one last look. I had already taken everything with me that mattered. Not things, not furniture, not photos, but peace. For the first time in years, I felt weightless, but not lost. Free, but not untethered. I carried my name with me, sharp and clear. I carried my story, not as a wound, but as proof. And wherever I ended up next, I knew I would walk through the door not as someone who had been cast aside, but as someone who had chosen the threshold. Because in the end, freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the quiet decision to never wear them again.